Hello, Soch 322. It is Friday, March 27th, and this lecture wraps up our week on church-state relationships and also introduces our week on a classic sociology of religion concept called civil religion. But before I go any farther, I just want you to know that your work this week coming back from spring break surprised me in the fact that I think almost everyone in the class got everything in on time and some really good evidence of actually digging into the issues that we were reading about this week. Tuesday's reading, many of you mentioned, was hard, and also historical. You're exactly right, and that's why I threw you Thursday's reading, which is really kind of a short commentary about a real hot topic around the separation of church and state, or as I should say, around the relationship between church and state, because that's really what we're studying, is the relationship of church and state and the way institutional patterns over time have tried to separate and use the metaphor of a wall of separation and how that's worked, whether it's worked, and what the characteristics of that process are. So in today's lecture, which probably won't be that long, I'm going to give some kind of summary thoughts about church and state relationships, reflect a little bit on what you all said about religion in the military, because those group discussions were really good. Almost, I would say, probably 80% of you responded that, you know, what's the big deal? We can work this thing out and have religious chaplains supported by the United States for military members. But there was a group of you that came up with some arguments against that. And what I want to do is talk about both sides of this argument, the characteristics of those arguments, and then the issues we're still left with. And then at the end of this lecture, I'll make some introductory comments about civil religion, which we're going to be reading about next week. And what I should mention is that this week was very much about looking at institutional relationships between these two major institutions. The state, which we should understand as having various levels, various actors, and morphing over time, and also church, which is a broad term to understand religion in general in a society, but also particular religious groups that represent religion in our American society. And what's important about that too is it's not a monolithic concept, right? There's lots of groups within the idea of church, and there's also lots of ideas that individuals have about what religion is and what quote-unquote church is in relationship to religion. For example, is church a actual church or a denomination, or is church a phrase that might get put into a law somewhere, or is church actually educating people about God or having a day for prayer? So those are all pieces of this institution we call church when we're thinking about church and state as institutional relationships. So let me zoom in really quick and show you the whiteboard just of some comments I want to make about church and state. I want to say, or I have just said a few things about institutional patterns. I want to say a few things about conflict. I want to talk about church and state relationships as a process, and then say a little bit about this metaphor of separation of church and state. So one thing about this institutional patterns, conflict, and church and state relationships as process is that many of you in your reflections on the Whitty reading said, well, why is it that we can't settle this once and for all? Or some of you commented that about your surprise in the original Constitutional Congress meetings about how many ideas came forward, how many were rejected, and just really how muddy this process is. And what I want to say to you is that all of that is evidence of how political processes usually work, in which point that these processes are usually about negotiation, they're usually about different understandings and interpretations. And the question is, who wins the day on that day? Now, who wins the day on that day sets for us what I mentioned in the last lecture, this kind of path-dependent set of events going forward. In other words, the rules of the day that win kind of become the rules of the game and define the boundaries in which all kind of struggles or conflicts going forward around church and state are going to be defined. But what's important is, especially in this issue of church and state relationships, is that the rules of the game as they were originally set were set up as basically these kind of guiding vague boundaries. And so over time, as a couple things have happened. First, as the nature of the American state has changed over time. So, for example, we've had the passage of other amendments like the 14th Amendment, the Due Process Amendment, that effectively basically push individual states themselves to get out of the religion game. We've also had a great centralization of the federal state over time. And then also in the 20th century, a number of attempts in a more religiously plural society to kind of struggle with the idea of what religion is to begin with. So we've had kind of those state changes. And then, as I've just highlighted, we've had changes kind of in the institution of religion, a massively growing pluralism, a change in that a religion has become more privatized in lives at the exact same time that it's become public or overt by some religious groups as well. So the boundaries of the game were set early on, but what's important is how the game gets played out within those boundaries have changed over time, because both the institutions of church and state have occurred over time. And then, as I had said something before about institutional patterns and conflict, in the case of the American state, there are all sorts of fractures, right? So when we say the word state, well, we're referring to a lot of things. We're referring to politicians in the decisions and games that they play. We're referring to the bodies that they're embedded in, so state level legislative bodies, federal legislative bodies, regulatory bodies. Some of my own work has been about how appointed political bureaucrats understand religion and what they do in their day-to-day struggles in terms of dealing with religion. And then we also have things like the court system or the executive branch. So we basically have all like these kind of cross-cutting processes that have the effect in our system to oftentimes channel these hot cases around First Amendment issues towards one body, so usually towards the Supreme Court, which, as we've seen with the military reading that we did for Thursday, the Supreme Court has not always dealt with these cases. So what's interesting is that our state process has the impact of oftentimes channeling these cases. Now, what's important is these issues of this process of the negotiation of church and state happen all the time. So whether it makes it to a court or not, it's happening all the time. The local principal has to make decisions about what songs are going to be sung at the holiday or Christmas celebration. The local park superintendent has to decide whether a religious monument can show up in their park. So there's all these kind of decisions that are made continuously, and they sometimes get channeled, and where they do get channeled would be towards the Supreme Court, which, though they make rules over the course of 200 years, it's all part of the game within these boundaries, within this path, with nothing ever quite settling out. In terms of the process of church-state relationships, well, we need to think about a couple things when we think about church and state relationships as a process. First off, because this is a process, because it's not defined, this has the effect of continually making both church and state as legitimate and strong spheres of life in the United States. And what's important there is there are different logics of decision-making as well as meaning that play out in a church religious sphere or play out in a political state sphere. And because this process never resolves fully the relationship between those two institutions, those institutions themselves are allowed to basically kind of continue to live on and to be important both in the lives of individual citizens but also in the public at large. So there's something about this process that itself feeds back into the institutions that then keep this process going. Also, in this process, as I've mentioned before, this boundary, if you will, gets navigated partly because of the agendas of different actors on both sides of the boundary, as well as the resources that actors can get. So let me give two examples of that. One recent agenda, starting with Bill Clinton, going through the recent George Bush and into the Obama administration, has been something called charitable choice, which is an attempt to try and get federal monies for federal priorities, such as marriage programs,